Silence is not an emptiness, as the young novices believe. It is not a void to be filled with prayer or the scratching of quills on parchment. Silence is a container, heavy and pressurized, a vessel forged from the iron of memory to hold back a scream that has been rising in my throat for 40 years. I sit here in the solar of the commandery of Saint-Eulalie, the winter sun casting weak, pale bars of light across the flagstones, and I listen to the wind howling through the Pyrenees. To the others it is just the wind, a herald of snow and bitter nights. To me it is the whistling of the great trebuchets of the Sultan, the sound of the air being torn apart by stones the size of millstones. I have not spoken a single word since the ship slipped out of the harbor into the black smoke, leaving the burning ruin of the world behind. My tongue sits in my mouth like a dead slug, withered and useless for speech, yet entirely capable of tasting the ash that still coats the back of my throat. They call me the silent brother, the holy hermit who has taken a vow of such extreme piety that he has renounced the human voice. They look at me with awe, these boys who have never seen a Saracen blade, never smelled the stench of Greek fire melting flesh. They think my silence is a gift to God. They are wrong. My silence is a prison for the devil. If I were to open my lips, if I were to let the dam break, I would not speak of Scripture. I would howl, I would unleash the cacophony of the dying, and it would shatter the stained glass of this peaceful chapel. My hands, gnarled now and spotted with the liver marks of age, tremble as I dip the quill into the inkhorn. The ink is black, dark as the blood that pooled in the streets of the city. I have been ordered by the Grand Master, not the one who died, but the one who manages ledgers in a palace far away, to write down my testimony. Write what you saw, the letter said, for the archives, for the legacy. Legacy, a word for men who build statues. We did not build statues that day. We built a mountain of corpses. I look at the blank parchment, the skin of a sheep stretched and dried, innocent and white. It seems a crime to defile it with the truth. But the silence is becoming too heavy to carry alone. It is crushing my chest, pressing on my ribs until I can barely draw breath during the offices. I must bleed the poison out onto the page, drop by drop, word by word, or I will die with the screams trapped inside me. And surely that would be a damnation deeper than any hell the priests threaten us with. I was 22 when the end began. I was strong then, a bull of a man, vain about the width of my shoulders and the skill of my sword arm. I remember the weight of my chainmail, the hauberk that felt like a second skin, a garment of steel rings that whispered with every movement. I loved that sound. It was the music of my calling. We were the knights of the temple, the sword arm of Christ, the defenders of the Holy Land. We walked with a swagger that terrified the merchants and reassured the pilgrims. We believed, with the arrogance of the young and the indoctrinated, that we were invincible because God was on our side. We did not understand that God plays a longer game, one in which the pieces are often swept from the board to make way for a new arrangement. We were in Acre, the last bastion, the final jewel in a crown that had long since been pawned. The city was a Babylon of noise, languages, and sins, enclosed by double walls that we thought could withstand the apocalypse. We were wrong. The apocalypse brought siege engines. The Mamluks came in April. They did not come as a disorderly horde. They came as a tide. I remember standing on the battlements of the king's tower, looking out over the plain, and feeling the blood drain from my face. The army of Al-Ashraf Khalil stretched from the mountains to the sea, a carpet of white tents and golden banners that rippled like a wheat field on fire. There were tens of thousands of horsemen, and behind them, the engines, the victorious, the furious, catapults so large they required a forest of timber to build. At night, their campfires mirrored the stars, erasing the horizon, so that it felt as if we were floating in a void of enemy fire. The sound began then, a rhythmic thrumming of drums and cymbals that never stopped. Doom, doom, clash, doom, doom, clash. It was a heartbeat designed to drive us mad, to deny us sleep, to remind us that every second was a countdown to the end. I served under the command of the marshal, a man of iron and prayer named Matthew. He was the one who told us to conserve our strength, to check our straps, to sharpen our edges. "Do not look at the numbers," he told us, his voice calm amidst the rising panic of the civilians. "Steel cuts flesh regardless of how many bodies are waiting. You are Templars. You are the rock against which the wave breaks." I clung to his words. I polished my sword until I could see my own fear reflected in the blade. I prayed the hours kneeling on the stone, but my prayers were hollow. I wasn't praying for victory. I was praying that when the time came, I wouldn't shame the red cross on my chest. I was praying that I wouldn't run. The bombardment started on a Tuesday. It was not like the skirmishes I had fought in the olive groves of Galilee. This was industrial slaughter. The stones that hit the walls shook the teeth in our heads. We could feel the impact through the soles of our boots. Great chunks of masonry, centuries old, were pulverized into dust that coated us like flour. And then came the pots of naphtha. They arced through the sky, trailing black smoke, looking like falling meteors. When they struck, they didn't just burn, they devoured. I saw a brother, a gentle man named Simon who tended the infirmary garden, engulfed in liquid fire. He didn't scream like a man. He shrieked like a banshee, flailing as the flames ate through his surcoat and cooked him inside his armor. We could not put him out. We had to watch him turn into a charred husk. That was the first crack in my soul. I stood there paralyzed, gripping my shield, unable to move, unable to help, just watching the fire consume a man I had broken bread with that morning. The siege dragged on for weeks. The outer wall crumbled. The towers were undermined. We fought in shifts, sleeping in our armor in the rubble, eating bread that tasted of grit and limestone. The brotherhood became something savage and desperate. We ceased to be individual men. We became a single organism of survival. We communicated in grunts and nods, saving our breath for the fighting. I killed my first man on the ramparts during a probing attack. He climbed a ladder, a Mamluk with wild eyes and a curved sword. I thrust my blade into his throat before he could clear the parapet. He fell backward, gurgling, and I felt nothing. No triumph, no horror. Just the mechanical satisfaction of a task completed. But the numbers were relentless. For every man we pushed off the wall, 10 more climbed up. They were climbing on the bodies of their own dead, a ramp of flesh rising to meet us. But the moment that sealed my silence, the moment the title of this chronicle refers to, was not during those weeks of grinding attrition. It was the final day. The day the weather turned, and the sky itself seemed to bruise purple, as if God had turned his face away in disgust. The accursed tower was buckling. The enemy was inside the first circuit. We were ordered to the breach. The Grand Master, Guillaume de Beaujeu, rode to the front. He was our father, our king, the heart of the order. To see him ride out, sword drawn, without his helm so his men could see his face, was to see the embodiment of valor. I ran beside his horse, my shield raised to protect his flank. The noise was deafening, the crumbling of stone, the roar of the fire, the screaming of thousands. And then I saw the arrow. It was not a grand shot. It was a stray shaft, loosed by an unseen archer in the smoke. It took the Grand Master in the armpit, the gap in his armor as he raised his sword. He didn't fall immediately. He slumped. He turned his horse. And when he looked at me, I saw the light go out of the world. That was the beginning of the silence. Not the arrow itself, but what I did, or did not do, in the hours that followed. The pen touches the parchment. The ink bleeds. The memory opens its mouth. The confusion that followed the arrow strike was a physical thing, a fog that descended instantly upon the lines. When a king falls, an army wavers. When a father falls, a family shatters. I was close enough to grab the bridle of the Grand Master's destrier, my gauntlets slick with the sweat and grit of the battle. Soldiers were shouting, their voices cracking with panic, accusing him of fleeing, of abandoning the breach. "Master, will you leave us?" a sergeant screamed, clutching at the stirrup. Guillaume de Beaujeu, the Lion of Acre, looked down with eyes that were already glazing over, the pain etching deep canyons into his noble face. He raised his hand, not in command, but in a gesture of final, terrible resignation. Je ne m'enfuis pas. He gasped, the blood bubbling at the corner of his lips. Je suis mort. I am not fleeing. I am dead. He lifted his arm to show the catastrophic wound, the feathers of the arrow protruding from the soft flesh beneath the shoulder, a mortal punctuation mark to his command. The sight of it broke the spine of the defense. The men around me, veterans who had weathered storms of steel, looked at the blood soaking the master's white surcoat and saw their own doom reflected in the crimson stain. The line did not just bend, it evaporated. We carried him back, a frantic, stumbling procession through streets that were rapidly turning into abattoirs. The discipline of the order, drilled into us through years of harsh dawns and silent meals, was the only thing that kept us moving as a unit. We formed a wedge around the dying master, a shield wall of moving steel cutting through the chaos of the collapsing city. Acre was dying. It was not a poetic death. It was a visceral, screaming dismemberment. The Mamluks had breached the accursed tower, and now they were pouring into the city like a black oil spill, relentless and toxic. I could hear them behind us, the clashing of cymbals, the ululating war cries, the sickening thud of axes hacking through doors. But worse were the sounds of the city's inhabitants. The narrow alleys were choked with civilians, women clutching bundles of useless heirlooms, old men dragging carts, children whose eyes were wide with a terror they could not comprehend. They grabbed at our cloaks, begging for salvation, begging for a place on the ships, begging for a miracle we did not possess. I had to shove a woman away, striking her with the flat of my shield to clear the path. The sensation of her frail bones against the wood sickened me, a nausea that rose in my throat and tasted of bile. I was a knight of the temple, sworn to protect the weak. Yet here I was, trampling them to save a dead man and a dying order. We reached the Templar fortress, the massive citadel by the sea that served as our headquarters. It was a city within a city, a monolith of stone with walls so thick they seemed geological rather than architectural. We hurried inside, the hooves of the horses clattering violently on the cobblestones of the courtyard. The great iron-bound gates were slammed shut behind us. The heavy wooden bars dropped into place with a boom that sounded like the closing of a tomb. The noise of the slaughter outside was instantly muffled, replaced by the frenetic echoing silence of the fortress. We laid the Grand Master on a table in the great hall. He died before the sun set, his breath rattling out of him in a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to take the soul of the fortress with it. I stood over him, looking at his waxen face, and felt a cold hollowness open up inside my chest. We were headless. We were cornered. We were the last vertebrae of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the executioner's axe was already swinging. Night fell, but there was no darkness. The sky was alight with the fires of the burning city. From the ramparts of the temple, we watched the destruction of our world. It was a scene from the apocalypse painted by a madman. The lower city was a furnace. We could see the Mamluks moving through the streets, torches in hand, hunting down the survivors. We could hear the screams drifting up on the smoke-choked wind, thousands of them, a chorus of agony that merged into a single high-pitched drone. I stood on the wall next to Brother Renaud, an older knight who had been a mentor to me since I was a squire. He was sharpening his sword, the rhythmic shh, shh of the whetstone the only sound he made. He did not look at the fire. He looked at the steel. "It is a good edge," he said softly, testing the blade with his thumb. "It will not bind in the bone." He spoke with the practical detachment of a butcher, but I saw the tremor in his hands. He was terrified, not of death, but of the waiting. That is the torture of the siege. The long, suffocating pause before the violence, where the mind has time to rot. There were perhaps 300 of us left in the fortress, along with 1,000 civilians who had managed to squeeze inside before the gates closed. The great hall was turned into a refugee camp, filled with the sobbing of widows and the whimpering of orphans. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, blood, and the omnipresent smoke. I walked among them, my armor feeling like a penance, the white mantle of my order stained gray with ash. A little girl no older than 5 reached out and touched my chainmail. Her hand was sticky with something dark. I looked down at her, and she offered me a piece of bread, dry and hard. She thought I was God's angel come to save them. I turned away, unable to meet her gaze, and retreated to the battlements. I could not offer her hope. I could only offer her a few more hours of breath before the inevitable end. The shame of it burned hotter than the fires below. We had failed. God had not sent a storm to wreck the enemy ships. He had not sent a plague to wither their army. He had sent silence. The tension in the fortress tightened with every hour. The Mamluks knew we were there. They surrounded the citadel, their torches forming a ring of fire around our stone island. They brought up their engines, the trebuchets dragging their wooden skeletons through the ruined streets to point their hungry arms at our walls. We could hear them chanting, a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that gnawed at our resolve. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. It was the sound of a rising tide that would not stop until it had drowned us all. I found myself checking my equipment obsessively. I tightened straps that were already tight. I checked the rivets on my gauntlets. I counted the arrows in the quivers. It was a way to keep my hands busy, to stop them from shaking. I looked at the sea, the dark, indifferent water stretching out to the west. A few ships were still visible on the horizon, fleeing for Cyprus. They were close enough to see the sails, but far enough to belong to another world. We had ships in the harbor, small galleys that could take a few, but the marshal had given the order. The fighting men stayed. We would buy time for the civilians to escape, or we would die trying. I remember sitting in the chapel as dawn approached, the stained glass illuminated not by the sun, but by the fires outside. I knelt next to a young brother named Godfrey, a boy of 19 who had only taken his vows a month prior. He was weeping, his face buried in his hands. "I am afraid, brother," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I do not want to burn. I do not want to be captured." I placed a hand on his shoulder. The metal of my gauntlet was cold against his neck. "We are Templars, Godfrey," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "We do not burn. We are the fire." It was a lie, a platitude of the barracks, but he nodded, wiping his nose on his sleeve. He looked at me with a desperate trust, believing that my experience, my strength, could somehow alter the fabric of reality. I hated him for it. I hated him because I knew I could not save him. I knew that before the sun set again, his blood would likely be on the floor of this very chapel. The wind howled outside, carrying the smell of roasting meat, human meat, and I closed my eyes, listening to the silence of God, waiting for the first stone to strike the tower. The journey was over. The trap was closed. Now there was only the killing floor. The horror of a siege is not in the fighting. Fighting is in release, a moment where the body takes over and the mind is silenced by the necessity of survival. The horror is in the waiting, and specifically in the listening. For 3 days we listened to our own graves being dug. The Mamluk sappers had tunneled beneath the foundations of the Tower of the Master, the great keep where we had made our last stand. We could hear them through the stone floors, a rhythmic, muffled tap-tap-tap of iron picks biting into the bedrock. It was the sound of deathwatch beetles gnawing at the heart of an oak tree. We stood in the cellars, pressing our ears against the cold walls, tracking their progress like physicians listening to a failing heart. Every inch they advanced was an inch closer to the collapse. The fortress, which had stood for 100 years as a symbol of permanence, suddenly felt fragile, a shell of eggshell balancing on a needle. The psychological weight of it was crushing. We walked softly, as if our very footsteps might trigger the landslide, glancing at the vaulted ceilings, waiting for the first crack to zigzag across the masonry like a lightning bolt of doom. The marshal, Peter de Severi, a man whose hair had turned white in the span of a week, ordered countermines to be dug. We stripped off our armor, working naked to the waist in the suffocating heat of the tunnels, swinging picks until our hands blistered and bled. We met the enemy in the dark, in cramped, suffocating wormholes where there was no room to swing a sword. We fought with daggers, with rocks, with our teeth, grappling in the pitch black, rolling over the bodies of the dead to strangle the living. I remember the smell of that darkness: sweat, urine, fear, and the damp, earthy scent of the grave. I killed a man in that tunnel, stabbing him repeatedly with a chisel, his warm blood spraying over my face in the dark, blinding me. I crawled back out into the light of the cellar, covered in mud and gore, gasping for air like a drowning man breaking the surface. There was no glory in it. We were rats fighting other rats in the bowels of the earth, while above us the sun shone on a world that had already forgotten us. Above ground, the assault was relentless. The Mamluks had dragged their catapults to the very edge of the moat, hurling pots of Greek fire against the gates. The iron heated up, glowing a dull, malevolent cherry red. We poured water, sand, vinegar, anything we had onto the flames, but the heat was intense enough to blister the skin from 20 paces. The smoke in the courtyard was thick and oily, reducing visibility to a few yards. We moved like phantoms in the haze, checking the defenses, reinforcing the barricades with furniture, tapestries, and piles of rubble. The civilians were huddled in the great hall, a mass of trembling humanity. The women had stopped weeping. They sat in a catatonic stupor, clutching their children. I saw mothers cutting their daughters' hair, smearing dirt on their faces, trying to make them ugly, trying to save them from the fate that awaited them when the doors broke. It was a futile gesture of love that broke my heart more than any wound I had ever received. By the 4th day of the siege of the fortress, the water began to run low. The cisterns were foul, tainted by the smoke and the debris. We rationed it by the cupful, one for the fighting men, half for the civilians. I remember watching a knight, a giant of a man named Hughes, give his ration to a pregnant woman. He did not speak, just handed her the ladle with a cracked, bleeding hand. She drank it, her eyes fixed on him with a terrified gratitude. He died 2 hours later, struck by a crossbow bolt on the ramparts, his throat too dry to even scream. Such were the quiet martyrdoms of those days, acts of grace that went unrecorded in the chronicles, witnessed only by the soot-stained stones and the silent God who watched us wither. We were dying by inches, parched, exhausted, and encircled, yet the discipline held. We sharpened our swords. We said our offices. We maintained the watch. It was the mechanical stubbornness of men who have nothing left but their form. Then came the offer. The Sultan's emissaries rode to the gate under a flag of truce. They offered terms: surrender the fortress, and the knights and civilians would be allowed to leave with their lives and their personal possessions. It was a lie. We knew it was a lie. The Mamluks did not take prisoners, they took heads. But the despair in the great hall was palpable. The civilians looked at us with pleading eyes, begging us to accept, to believe in the mirage of mercy. Peter de Severi looked out at the sea of enemy troops, at the impossible odds, and made the choice. He would negotiate. He would go out to the Sultan's tent. I stood by the gate as he rode out, a small, dignified figure riding into the maw of the beast. I wanted to stop him. I wanted to scream that honor demanded we die with our swords in our hands, that trusting a viper was suicide. But I held my tongue. That was the habit forming, the cement hardening around my voice. I watched him go, and I felt the cold certainty that I would never see him alive again. The tension during his absence was agonizing. We stood on the walls, watching the distant tent of the Sultan, waiting for a sign. The sun beat down on our helmets, cooking our brains. Godfrey, the young knight, stood beside me, his knuckles white on the hilt of his sword. "Do you think they will let us go?" he asked, his voice a whisper of desperate hope. I looked at the smoke rising from the ruins of the city, at the piles of heads the Mamluks had stacked like pyramids by the harbor. "Pray, brother," was all I could say. Pray for a swift end. I could not lie to him. I could not tell him that there was a boat waiting to take him to Cyprus, to cool wine and soft beds. We were the sacrifice. We were the burnt offering on the altar of a failed crusade. When the marshal returned, it was not with a treaty, but with a reprieve that felt like a trap. The Sultan had agreed, or so it seemed. A detachment of Mamluks was to be allowed into the fortress to oversee the evacuation. We were to lay down our arms. It went against every instinct I possessed. To open the gate, to let the wolf into the fold. But the order was given. The heavy bars were lifted. The gates groaned open, and in they came, not a disciplined guard, but a leering, swaggering mob of soldiers, eyes darting from the gold on the altar to the women in the corner. I stood with my hand on my sword, my body rigid with tension. I saw a Mamluk soldier reach out and grab the veil of a young noblewoman. She screamed. He laughed, pulling her towards him. Another soldier kicked an old priest who was too slow to move. The truce was dissolving before the ink was even dry. The air crackled with violence. I looked at the marshal. He was pale, realizing his mistake. The predator had not come to negotiate. He had come to play with his food. I saw Godfrey step forward, his face flushed with righteous anger. "Do not touch her," he shouted, his voice cracking. The Mamluk laughed and shoved him back. Godfrey's hand went to his sword. The silence of the courtyard shattered. It did not start with a command. It started with a single act of refusal. A knight near the door drew a dagger and stabbed a Mamluk who was tearing the dress of a girl. The scream was the signal. Clang. Swords were drawn. The truce evaporated. The fortress erupted into chaos. We were not leaving. We were not surrendering. We were going to die here on these stones, but we would die clean. I drew my blade, the sound ringing like a bell in the morning air, and stepped into the melee. The waiting was over. The listening was over. The killing had returned. The slaughter in the courtyard was short, sharp, and wet. The Mamluk detachment, arrogant in their belief that we were broken men, found themselves trapped in a killing jar with 300 lions. The rage that had been corked inside us during the humiliating negotiations exploded with a force that felt less like combat and more like an execution. I remember the sensation of my sword biting into the lamellar armor of a soldier who had tried to drag a woman away. The steel shuddered, then sheared through leather and bone. He looked at me with genuine shock, his mouth opening to cry out, but only blood emerged. We did not shout. We did not offer quarter. We moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency, cutting them down where they stood. Within minutes, the stone flags were slick with a slurry of gore, and the 50 Mamluks lay in tangled heaps, their silk tunics stained dark. We heaved their bodies over the battlements, a grim message to the Sultan that the temple would not be bought, and it would not be mocked. As the heavy gate slammed shut again, dropping the iron bars back into place, a heavy silence fell over us. We looked at each other, breathing hard, steam rising from our armor in the morning chill. We had washed our honor clean, but we had signed our death warrants. The reaction from the enemy camp was immediate and apocalyptic. The drums, which had maintained a steady, maddening rhythm for weeks, accelerated into a frenzied thunder that vibrated in our chests. The Sultan, enraged by the massacre of his men and the rejection of his mercy, unleashed everything. The sky turned black as the trebuchets resumed their work, hurling stones that pulverized the upper battlements. But worse was to come. The Marshal, Peter de Severy, looked out at the carnage and the thousands of civilians huddled in the great hall, women praying, children too terrified to cry, and his conscience broke. He believed, with the desperate delusion of a good man in a world of monsters, that he could still save them. He believed that if he offered himself, if he went out and explained that the breach of truce was provoked by the undisciplined Mamluks, the Sultan might spare the innocents. "I must go back," he said, his face pale as parchment, his eyes red-rimmed. "I must try." I stood by the postern gate as he prepared to ride out again. He took a small escort of knights, men who knew they were riding to their graves. I wanted to grab his bridle. I wanted to strike him, to shake him, to scream that honor did not mean suicide, that the Sultan was a rabid dog who knew no reason. But the silence held me. It was already wrapping its chains around my throat. I simply nodded, a slow, mournful dip of my chin, acknowledging his sacrifice. He rode out under a white flag, a small speck of purity in a landscape of ash and mud. We crowded the ramparts to watch. The distance was short, but the journey seemed to take a lifetime. We saw them reach the Mamluk lines. We saw them dismount. We saw them surrounded. There was no conversation this time. There was no tent, no sherbet, no diplomatic fiction. We saw the flash of scimitars in the sunlight, bright and sudden. The marshal and his escort were cut down before they could even speak. Their heads were hoisted onto lances immediately, paraded in front of the walls to the cheers of the enemy army. A groan went up from the ramparts beside me, a sound of collective despair. The last bridge was burned. There was no way out but through the fire. The final phase of the siege began with a sound that came not from the sky, but from the deep earth. The Mamluk sappers had finished their work beneath the tower of the master. They had packed the tunnels with timber and pig fat, and now they set them alight. We could feel the heat rising through the flagstones of the cellars, warming the soles of our boots. The fortress was sitting on top of a furnace. The structural integrity of the massive keep began to fail. Stone groaned against stone, a high-pitched screeching like the dying cry of a leviathan. Cracks appeared in the walls of the great hall, running from floor to ceiling in jagged lightning bolts. Dust poured down constantly, coating the refugees in a gray shroud. We knew the tower would fall. The only question was when. We moved the civilians to the seaside walls, the furthest point from the undermining, but there was nowhere truly safe. The island of stone was sinking. That night, the Brotherhood was distilled to its purest essence. There were no more ranks, no more commanders. We were simply men waiting for the end. We gathered in the chapel for the final mass. The priest, an old man with trembling hands, hurried through the Latin, skipping verses as the walls shook around us. I looked at the faces of my brothers in the flickering candlelight. Godfrey was there, his face streaked with soot, sharpening his dagger with obsessive focus. Brother Thomas, who had lost an eye in the first week, sat with his head bowed, clutching a rosary. We shared the Eucharist, stale bread and watered wine, and it tasted like ashes. "This is my body broken for you," the priest whispered. I swallowed the host, feeling it stick in my dry throat. Broken, I thought. We are all broken. I looked at Godfrey. He looked back, his eyes wide and glassy. "I will stay by you," he whispered to me. "Do not leave me alone when the walls come down." I gripped his shoulder, my fingers digging into the mail. I could not promise him life. I could only promise him company in death. At dawn, the wooden props in the mines burned through. The collapse was not instantaneous. It was a slow, majestic, terrifying surrender to gravity. The ground lurched violently, throwing us off our feet. A roar like the end of the world erupted from the landward side of the fortress. We scrambled up the stairs to the battlements, choking on the dust, and saw the impossible. The great tower of the master, a mountain of masonry, was sliding. It tilted, hung suspended for a heartbeat that defied physics, and then crashed inwards, creating a ramp of rubble that led straight into the heart of our defenses. The breach was wide enough for 20 men to ride abreast. The dust cloud was enormous, blotting out the sun, turning the morning into a twilight of gray fog. And through the fog, we heard them. The shrill war cries, the thunder of drums. The Mamluks were charging the breach. "Form the line!" I roared, my voice ragged, surprised that I could still speak at all. "For the temple, for the cross." We ran to the top of the rubble slope, forming a shield wall at the choke point. We were the cork in the bottle. Behind us, the women and children screamed. In front of us, the darkness came alive with steel. The first wave hit us with the force of a tidal wave. I was slammed backward, my feet sliding on the loose stones. I drove my shield into a face, thrust my sword into a gut, pulled it free, and thrust again. It was not fencing. It was butchery. It was hacking at a wall of flesh that pushed against us with the weight of thousands. The air was thick with the smell of blood and pulverized lime. I lost all sense of time. There was only the swing, the impact, the parry, the breath. I saw Godfrey go down. He was fighting bravely, stabbing wildly with his short sword, but a Mamluk mace caught him on the side of the helm. The metal crumpled. He fell without a sound, disappearing under the stamping boots of the enemy. I tried to reach him, to pull him up, but the press was too great. I was forced back step by step over the bodies of my friends. We were dying. The line was thinning. For every Mamluk we killed, 2 more stepped over the corpse. I was covered in wounds, cuts on my arms, A deep bruise on my ribs, a gash on my thigh, but I felt no pain. I felt only a cold, crystalline clarity. This was the moment I had been trained for. This was the purpose of my life. To stand between the darkness and the light, and to hold the door until the hinges broke. We were pushed back into the courtyard, retreating towards the inner sanctum. The Mamluks poured over the rubble like ants, swarming the walls, dropping into the gathered civilians. The screaming reached a pitch that pierced my soul. I saw knights throw themselves into the mob, abandoning defense to buy seconds for the women to run. But run where? There was nowhere left to run. The sea was at our backs, and the fire was in our faces. I found myself back to back with Renaud, the old veteran. His sword was broken, just a jagged shard of steel, but he was still fighting, using his shield as a bludgeon. "It is a good day to die, brother," he shouted over the din, blood spraying from his mouth. "The king waits for us." He laughed, a mad, defiant sound, and threw himself into a cluster of spears. I was alone. The circle was closing. I retreated to the heavy oak doors of the inner keep, the last sanctuary, and prepared to sell my life for the highest price I could extract. The silence was gone. The world was nothing but noise and blood, and I roared back at it, a final wordless challenge to the indifference of the sky. The sanctuary of the inner keep was not a refuge, it was a waiting room for the slaughterhouse. We had been pushed back, step by bloody step, until the few dozen surviving knights stood shoulder to shoulder in the vestibule of the great hall, a phalanx of battered steel protecting the huddling mass of humanity behind us. The doors, massive slabs of Lebanese cedar reinforced with iron bands, were already splintering under the assault of axes and battering rams from the other side. Each blow echoed through the vaulted chamber like the tolling of a funeral bell, shaking dust from the ceiling that drifted down to coat the sobbing women and children in a ghostly shroud. I stood near the center of the line, my chest heaving, my breath rasping in a throat raw from smoke and screaming. I looked down at my sword. The blade was notched and dull, stained a dark, tacky brown. It was a tool that had lost its purpose. We were no longer fighting to win. We were no longer even fighting to survive. We were fighting for the dignity of the end, hoping to buy enough time for these souls to what? To pray? To make peace with a God who had clearly abandoned us to the fire? This was the moment the silence began to take root in my soul. It was not a sudden hush, but a creeping, cold realization that words, prayer, command, comfort, were utterly devoid of power. I looked over my shoulder at the civilians. There was a young woman, her clothes torn, clutching a baby so tightly against her breast that I feared she would crush it. She looked at me, her eyes wide, pleading for a miracle I did not possess. "Save us." Her lips moved, though no sound came out over the din of the battering ram. "Save us." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. I was a Templar. I had sworn vows on the altar of the Holy Sepulchre. Non nobis Domine. Not unto us, but unto thy name give glory. I had renounced land, title, and love to become a shield for the defenseless. And here, at the end of all things, my shield was splintered, my arm was tired, and my vows were nothing but ashes in my mouth. I could not save her. I could not save the child. I could not even save myself. The lie of my existence was laid bare in the terror of her gaze. A terrible anger began to rise within me, replacing the fear. It was a cold, venomous rage directed not at the Mamluks, but at the empty air above us. Where was the host of angels? Where was the lightning from heaven? We had been faithful. We had bled into the sand for 2 centuries. We had built castles of stone and prayer to hold this land for Christ. And for what? To be butchered like livestock in a dark hall while the heathen mocked us. I gripped my sword until my knuckles popped, wanting to scream blasphemies, wanting to curse the silence of God. But my tongue felt heavy, paralyzed by the enormity of the betrayal. If God could watch this, the slaughter of the innocent, the desecration of the holy, and remain silent, then what use were my words? If the Creator spoke only in the language of suffering, then I would answer with the language of stone. I would become as mute as the walls that were failing us. The doors gave way with a sound like a thunderclap. The wood shattered, exploding inward in a shower of splinters and iron. The Mamluks poured into the vestibule, a screaming torrent of silk and steel. The phalanx held for a moment, a dam of desperate men stemming the tide. I stepped forward, thrusting mechanically, my body moving on instinct while my mind floated above the carnage, detached and horrified. I saw a brother to my right, a man named Hugh, who had once joked about the quality of wine in Cyprus, take a spear to the throat. He fell gargling, clutching at the shaft, his eyes locking with mine as the light faded. He didn't look peaceful. He looked surprised. He looked like a man who had just realized that the stories of martyrdom were lies told to keep soldiers in line. I stepped over his body to fill the gap, swinging my sword in a grim arc that severed a hand reaching for me. There was no glory here. There was only the wet copper smell of the abattoir. We were pushed back into the main hall proper. The Mamluks were inside now, fanning out, their eyes wide with the lust for plunder and slaves. They saw the women. The discipline of the battle dissolved into something primal and ugly. I saw a group of soldiers bypass our line, rushing towards the civilians like wolves descending on a flock. "No!" I shouted, the sound tearing from my throat, raw and desperate. I broke formation, charging towards them, abandoning the line. I cut down the first man, striking him in the spine. I turned to the second, parrying a blow that would have taken my head. But there were too many. I was surrounded, slashing wildly, fueled by a frantic, hopeless desire to stop the inevitable. And then the world shifted. It was not a metaphor. The ground beneath our feet lurched violently, knocking friend and foe alike to the flagstones. A deep, groaning rumble emanated from the very bones of the earth, a sound so low it was felt in the teeth rather than heard. The undermining. The fires in the tunnels had finally done their work. The great columns that supported the vaulted ceiling of the keep, columns that had stood for 100 years, began to buckle. I looked up, dazed, blood running into my eyes from a cut on my forehead. I saw the keystone of the central arch crack. A spiderweb of fissures raced across the stone ceiling, dust pouring down in thick, choking curtains. The fighting stopped. For a heartbeat, Christian and Saracen alike froze, united by the sudden, overwhelming realization of a power greater than war. I looked back at the woman with the baby. She was huddled against a pillar that was already tilting. She wasn't looking at the Mamluks anymore. She was looking up at the ceiling, at the tons of stone that were about to descend. She pulled the blanket over the baby's face, a final futile gesture of protection. In that moment, the moral struggle that had raged in my heart, the question of whether to fight, whether to surrender, whether to pray, evaporated. The answer was not in the sword nor in the prayer book. The answer was gravity. God was not sending a miracle to save us from the enemy. He was sending the mountain to bury us all together. The inevitability of it crushed the last remnants of my faith in divine intervention. There was no judgment day coming with trumpets. There was only the physics of destruction. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling towards the woman, though I knew I could not reach her in time. A Mamluk captain, recovering his balance, raised his sword to strike me, but he paused, looking up as a chunk of masonry the size of a cart crashed to the floor between us, obliterating 3 of his men. The hall was screaming now. The stone itself was screaming. It was a cacophony of grinding geology that drowned out the human voices. I saw the Grand Master's words in my mind. I am dead. We were all dead. We had been dead since the first stone was laid. The hubris of the temple, to think we could build a fortress that would outlast God's will. I stopped moving. I lowered my sword. I stood amidst the swirling dust and the falling debris, and I looked at the chaos with a calm that felt like madness. I saw the cruelty of the Mamluks turn to terror as they realized they were trapped in the tomb they had dug. I saw the fear of the civilians turn to acceptance. I saw the truth of the world, that we are small and fragile and that silence is the only honest response to the enormity of death. I locked my jaw. I bit down on my tongue until I tasted the copper of my own blood. I made a pact with the void. I would watch, I would witness, but I would never again add my voice to the noise of a world that could allow this to happen. The ceiling gave a final, agonizing groan. The supports snapped like dry twigs, and the sky came crashing down. Darkness is not merely the absence of light. It is a physical weight, a crushing, suffocating blanket of stone and dust that presses against the eyelids and fills the mouth with the taste of ancient earth. I do not know how long I lay in the womb of the ruined tower. Time had ceased to exist, replaced by the throbbing rhythm of the blood in my ears and the dull, grinding ache in my left leg. I awoke to a silence so profound it felt like deafness. The screaming was gone. The clash of steel was gone. The roar of the fire was gone. There was only the stillness of the grave. I tried to move, and a sharp agony shot up my spine, a reminder that I was still tethered to a body that could feel pain. I was pinned, wedged in a pocket of air formed by 2 fallen beams of cedar and a slab of masonry that had landed at an angle. By the grace of God, or the cruelty of fate, the architecture that had failed to protect my brothers had conspired to spare me. I was the sole living insect trapped in amber, preserved while the world around me had been pulverized. I pushed against the debris. A shower of grit rained down on my face. I coughed, but the sound was weak, a dry rasp that died instantly in the confined space. I remembered the vow I had made in the final seconds before the impact. Silence. I did not call out. To whom would I call? The Mamluks above? The dead below? I began to dig. It was a slow, torturous process. My gauntlets were gone, stripped away in the chaos, and my bare hands tore against the rough limestone. I dug with the desperation of a badger, clawing at the loose rubble, shifting stones one by one. The air in the pocket was growing stale, hot and thick with the metallic tang of blood. I worked in the dark, guided only by touch, feeling the cold, stiff limbs of those buried with me. I touched a face, a beard, a nose, an open mouth filled with dust. Was it Renaud? Was it the Mamluk captain? In the dark, the dead have no heraldry. They are all simply cold clay. After what felt like an eternity, a beam of light pierced the gloom. It was a single, dusty shaft, gray and weak, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I widened the hole, pushing aside a broken shield, and dragged myself upward. I emerged into the twilight of the aftermath. The great keep of the Templars, the pride of Christendom, was gone. In its place was a mountain of jagged stone, timber, and bodies. The dust cloud still hung over the ruins, a spectral fog that muted the sun. I stood up, swaying on my injured leg, and looked out over the devastation. The silence I had felt underground was mirrored in the world above. The battle was over. The Mamluks were not cheering. They were moving slowly through the rubble, stunned by the magnitude of the destruction they had wrought. The collapse had killed thousands, defenders and attackers alike. It was a mass grave shared by enemies who had died locked in each other's arms. I limped across the jagged landscape of the ruin. I saw the arm of a child protruding from under a block of granite, the small fingers still clutching the blanket. I saw the broken hilt of a sword glinting in the dust. I walked like a ghost, covered in gray ash, indistinguishable from the stones. A group of Mamluk survivors, battered and bloody, saw me. They did not raise their weapons. They stared at me with hollow eyes, perhaps thinking I was a djinn rising from the earth, or perhaps simply too exhausted to kill one more man. I walked past them. I did not run. I did not hide. I walked with the slow, deliberate pace of the dead, heading towards the sea. The water was calling me. It was the only clean thing left in a world of filth. I reached the seawall, or what remained of it. The harbor was a graveyard of ships. Galleys burned in the shallows, their skeletons black against the water. Bodies bobbed in the surf, rolling with the tide. But there, in the shadow of a crumbled jetty, was a small skiff, bobbing on the waves. It was empty, its rope frayed but holding. I climbed down the rocks, the salt spray stinging my wounds. I cut the rope with a sharp stone. I pushed the boat out. I rowed. I rowed until my hands bled, until the muscles in my back screamed. I rowed away from the burning city, away from the mountain of stone, away from the silence of the tomb. I rode until Acre was nothing but a pillar of black smoke on the horizon. And in all that time, as the tears cut tracks through the dust on my face, I did not utter a single sound. The scream remained inside, a prisoner for life. I was the silent Templar, and I had left my voice buried under the tower of the Master, along with my brothers and my soul. The candle on my desk has burned down to a stub of wax, a pool of tallow that drowns the wick in its own substance. The shadows in the solar have lengthened, stretching across the floor like the creeping fingers of the twilight that swallowed my life so many years ago. I look at the stack of parchment before me, the ink still wet and glistening in the fading light. It is done. The testimony is written. I have poured the poison from my veins onto these sheets, scratching out the geometry of the slaughter with a hand that shakes not from age, but from the vibration of the memories that have never settled. I place the quill down. The sound of it striking the wood, tap, is the loudest sound I have made in 40 years. Outside, the wind of the Pyrenees has died down, leaving a stillness that settles over the commandery of Saint-Eulalie like a shroud. The snow has begun to fall, large silent flakes that blanket the world in white, erasing the edges of the mountains, erasing the paths, erasing the world, just as the dust erased Acre. It is a clean silence, this snow. It is not like the silence of the ruin. I lean back in my chair, the wood groaning under my weight. The other brothers will be gathering for Vespers soon. I can hear the distant, muffled shuffling of sandals on stone, the rustle of wool habits. They will look at me as they always do, with a mixture of reverence and pity. There sits the silent brother, they will think. The holy man who communes only with God. They do not know that I do not commune with God. I commune with the dead. They do not know that my silence is not a vow of piety but an act of containment. If I were to open my mouth, if I were to allow even a single breath to escape as a word, I fear that I would not be able to stop. I fear that the scream I swallowed in the crypt of the Tower of the Master would erupt with such force that it would shatter the stained glass of this chapel, crack the stone walls, and wither the crops in the fields. I am a vessel under pressure. I am the reliquary of a scream that contains the death throes of an entire age. I survived the sea. I survived the drift to Cyprus, a sun-blistered husk of a man found floating half-dead by a Genoese merchant ship. They asked me my name. I did not answer. They asked me of the city. I stared at them with eyes that had seen the end of the world, and they turned away, crossing themselves. I was taken in by the remnant of the order, a broken thing limping on the crutch of its past glory. I watched as the years turned, as the fervor of the Crusades cooled into the cynical politics of Europe. I watched as the order was betrayed, not by the Saracen, but by a Christian king and a weak pope. I saw my brothers arrested, tortured, burned at the stake for heresies they did not commit. I saw Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, turn to ash on the Ile de la Cité in Paris. And through it all, I remained safe. I remained untouchable. Why? Because who bothers to torture a mute? Who interrogates a man whose mind is thought to be broken by God? My silence was my shield. It allowed me to vanish into the background, to become a piece of furniture in the house of the Lord, ignored and overlooked while the lions were butchered. This is the terrible discovery I have made in the long, quiet decades of my survival. That cowardice can look remarkably like holiness to those who do not know the truth. I am not a saint. I am a man who was too afraid to die with his brothers, and then too afraid to speak of how they died. I have hoarded my life like a miser hoards gold, spending it in the safe, quiet corners of the world while the best men I ever knew rot in the mass graves of the East. The Silent Templar. It is a title of mockery, though only I can hear the laughter. It is the laughter of the Mamluks, the laughter of the flames, the laughter of the devil who knows that he bought my soul not with a bag of silver, but with the simple gift of breath. And yet, as I look at the manuscript, I feel a shifting in the bedrock of my guilt. Perhaps there is a purpose to the cowardice. Perhaps the silence was necessary. If I had spoken, if I had told my story in the taverns of Cyprus or the courts of France, it would have become just another war story. It would have been diluted, argued over, turned into a song by a minstrel to be played for drunkards. By holding it inside, by letting it ferment in the dark pressure of my soul for 40 years, I have preserved the purity of the horror. I have kept the memory of Godfrey, of the marshal, of the woman with the baby, safe from the corruption of casual speech. Now, written down in this final hour, the truth is solid. It is heavy. It is undeniable. The words on these pages are not stories. They are tombstones. I have finally built the monument that the order was denied. I stand up, my joints stiff, the pain in my old leg, the leg crushed by the tower, flaring as a familiar companion. I walk to the window and push open the shutter. The cold air rushes in, biting and sharp, smelling of pine and ice. It cleanses the scent of old ink and wax from my nose. I look out at the mountains, dark shapes against the indigo sky. I am ready now. The task is done. The witness has given his testimony. I feel a lightness in my chest that I have not felt since I was a boy in the orchards of my father's estate, before I took the cross, before I learned that honor is a heavy coat that drowns you when the flood comes. I will go down to the chapel. I will kneel in my stall. I will listen to the brothers chant the Salve Regina. And when the time comes, when the final darkness descends, not the darkness of the rubble, but the gentle darkness of the end, I will not fight it. I will greet it as an old friend who has kept me waiting too long, and perhaps on the other side of that veil, in the true silence of eternity, I will find them again. I will see Godfrey's face, unmarred by the mace. I will see the marshal, his head restored. I will see the Grand Master standing tall in the light, and there, in that place where no shadows fall, I will finally open my mouth. I will draw a breath that does not taste of ash, and I will speak their names. I leave this manuscript on the table. It is for those who come after, for the curious eyes of a future that will forget us. Do not look for glory in these pages. Look for the cost. Look for the silence between the words. That is where the truth lives. The wind picks up again, whistling through the stone arches, a lonely, high-pitched sound. It is time. I pull my hood over my head, hiding my face one last time. I blow out the candle. The smoke rises, a thin gray ribbon dancing in the dark, vanishing into nothingness. Non nobis, domine, non nobis, not unto us. I turn to the door, and for the first time in 40 years, I walk into the dark without looking back. The silence is no longer a prison. It is a key, and the door is finally opening.